The prairie is flat and the sky above Cass County, Illinois, is the color of pewter in the October of 1886. Pan down from that gray horizon and the land reveals itself in long, cold rectangles of harvested fields and bare fence lines running ruler straight to the edge of sight. One property sits apart from the others, 2 acres, a weathered shed, and a woman standing alone in a yard full of rust. 9 dead machines, 9 sets of iron and rot that no man in 3 counties would touch. She paid $43 for all of them. Move closer. Her coat is canvas, her hands are calloused, and her eyes carry no apology. The farmers at the fence are laughing. Her own uncle will not speak to her for 4 years. Every person who knows her name has already decided how this ends. She hasn't told them what she knows. She hasn't told anyone. Now let the story begin. In October of 1886, at the Cass County Property Seizure Yard outside of Chandlerville, Illinois, a 43-year-old never-married woman named Ottoline Brecht Halversen paid $43 in cash for 9 McCormick marsh harvesters and their paired portable steam threshers that no one else would touch. The rust on them had long since outpaced whatever red paint the factory had applied. The auctioneer, a county man named Aldous Greaves, who managed civil forfeitures and property seizures for the district, took her folded bills with the expression of a man receiving an insult he hadn't quite decided how to answer. He had been attempting to liquidate those 9 sets of equipment for the better part of 14 months, first individually, then in paired lots, then as a single indivisible bundle priced at scrap iron value. The listing had become a joke in the Chandlerville courthouse, the kind of joke that stops being funny only when it becomes embarrassing. He paused before accepting the cash, his broad hand hovering above hers as though waiting for her to flinch, to laugh, to reveal the punchline hidden somewhere in her steady gray eyes. He found nothing there but patience. His voice carried across the cold gravel of the yard, pitched deliberately for the half-dozen farmers loitering against the cedar fence posts. $43 won't cover 9 tow-outs, ma'am. Not even close. 2 of the men chuckled into their coat collars. A third shook his head at the ground. The one who did not chuckle, who did not shake his head in amusement, was her uncle, Ruprecht Brecht, who leased the 320 acres adjoining her father's old property. He stood with his arms folded across his chest and looked at his niece, not with contempt, but with something that cut deeper than contempt, a slow, deliberate sorrow, the expression a man uses when he has already made peace with a bad outcome and is simply waiting for it to arrive. Ottoline did not look back at him. She folded her receipt, a carbon copy already smearing at the edges, and placed it into the inside pocket of her canvas workcoat. She owned them now. The rust, the seized mechanisms, the cracked wooden reel fingers, the bird nests packed into the grain guards, all of it. By the autumn of 1893, the laughter in Cass County and 2 counties surrounding it would go silent in a way that no one who had stood at that cedar fence would ever fully explain to their children. To understand how a woman with $43, a dead father's ledger, and the organized contempt of an entire community could change the way 3 Illinois counties brought in their harvests, you have to understand the silence she worked inside. You have to go back to the sound of the October wind moving through 9 dead machines in that Chandlerville yard and hear not the sound of failure, but the sound of an overture playing to an empty hall, patient as stone, waiting for its audience to arrive. In the fall of 1886, every farmer with soil under his fingernails in Cass County believed he understood what he had witnessed at the seizure yard. They replayed it over morning coffee at the Chandlerville feed merchant, their thick ceramic mugs warm between callous palms as the story took root and spread. They called it Ottoline's Folly, a small sad tale to pass between talk of corn prices and the coming hard freeze. The name traveled efficiently, the way only unflattering names travel in small Illinois counties, hitching rides on casual conversation until it arrived everywhere simultaneously. The first laugh, the one that gave all the others their permission, had belonged to Aldous Greaves. Standing in the yard above the dead machines, he had made his pronouncement with the particular confidence of a man who believes he is doing someone a kindness by stating what everyone else already knows. He had not addressed Ottoline directly. He had addressed the audience of farmers at the fence, turning slightly sideways so his voice could carry cleanly over their heads and across the brown October grass. He said the $43 would not cover the tow-outs, and then he let the rest of the implication hang unfinished in the cold air, let alone a woman running a 2-acre property alone. Let alone her. The sale concluded on those terms. The verdict had been rendered before the money changed hands. The second current of mockery came from the women of the county, quieter than the men's laughter but more durable. At the Ashland General Store, Wilhelmina Drost, who had served as secretary of the Cass County Agricultural Women's Society for 11 unbroken years, held court near the dry goods shelves on the Tuesday following the auction. She was a woman whose opinions had the solidity of church furniture, heavy, unmovable, arranged exactly where she had decided they should be. She did not whisper. Whispering implied uncertainty, and Wilhelmina Drost had not been uncertain about anything since approximately 1871. "It is unseemly," she told the two farmers' wives standing near the bolt of blue wool. Gerhard Brecht was a respected man in this county. Careful man. To have his only daughter dragging the Brecht name through a seizure yard, buying wreckage that grown men with full operations wouldn't touch it, confuses the natural order of things. She paused to examine a spool of thread with the gravity of a woman examining evidence. He would be turning in his grave, poor man. The words moved from the general store to the church, social to the harvest potluck, weaving themselves into the county's understanding of Ottoline Brecht Halversen, until she was no longer simply an eccentric spinster running her father's old repair shed. She had become a disruption, a cautionary illustration, the kind of story mothers mention to daughters without quite finishing the sentence. The hardest conversation, the one that left marks the public laughter could not, came from her own blood. 8 days after the auction, Ruprecht Brecht drove his wagon to a stop along the fence line, dividing his leased cornfields from the 2 acres Ottoline had inherited: the modest house, the large weathered implement repair shed, the small barn holding her 2 draft horses. He did not climb down from the wagon. He simply sat up on the bench with the reins loose in his hands and waited for her to walk over from the shed, which she did without hurrying, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. He had her father's eyes, pale blue and direct, and he used them now with the full weight of a man who had genuinely convinced himself that what he was about to say was an act of love. "Ottoline." He kept his voice low, as though the fence posts might carry it somewhere damaging. "People are talking, all the way to Beardstown. They are saying you are hauling scrap iron, that you have lost your sense of what is practical." He waited. She did not fill the silence. He tried again. "Your father saved every dollar he earned. He built a name in this county that meant something. Don't do this to that name." Ottoline stopped a few feet from the wagon wheel. She met his gaze the way she met most things, directly, without performance. "It's Brecht equipment, Ruprecht." Her voice was flat as a ruled line, carrying nothing beyond the fact of the statement itself. He stared at her and waited for the explanation that would make the sentence mean something sensible. "The machines bore McCormick stamps, not Brecht." She was speaking a language he did not have the vocabulary for, and her refusal to translate it landed on him as stubbornness, as delusion. He shook his head slowly. "Your father worked 30 years to be trusted in this county. Don't waste that." He picked up the reins. The wagon shifted under him as the horses felt the change. "I'm asking you plain." "I know you are," Ottoline said. That was all she offered. He released a long breath that carried disappointment the way autumn air carries the smell of turned fields, completely, in every direction at once. He put the wagon in motion without another word, without a backward look, and the dust from his wheels hung in the cold air long after the sound of the horses had faded. It would be 4 years before he spoke to her again with anything approaching ordinary human warmth. The rupture was complete, and she was left standing at the fence line alone, surrounded by 9 steel monuments to what the whole of Cass County had already decided was her undoing. Ottoline Brecht Halversen was born in 1843, the same year the Illinois legislature was still debating where to locate the state's permanent capital. She grew up in the shadow of her father's implement repair shed in Ashland, where the smell of linseed oil and heated metal was as familiar as the smell of bread, and where the satisfaction of a correctly diagnosed machine was more legible to her than most of what she encountered in the social world of a small Illinois farming county. Her father, Gerhard Brecht, had come to Illinois from the Rhineland one time 1849 with a German immigrant's suspicion of waste and a craftsman's reverence for the interior logic of machines. He understood mechanical systems the way a physician understands the body, not merely as collections of parts, but as integrated organisms with their own particular histories, their own recurring vulnerabilities, their own secret languages of sound and vibration. He kept a ledger, a cloth-bound volume he began filling in 1858, recording every repair his shed undertook in a hand that was small, precise, and faintly angular with the ghost of German script. Each entry named the machine's owner, the presenting complaint, what the machine actually needed, and his private observations about the operator whose habits had contributed to the failure. He did not mince those observations. He had no sons. He had Ottoline, and by the time she was 8 years old, he had decided that this was sufficient. He taught her to read a machine before she taught herself to read a social gathering. By 12, she could identify a misaligned knife section by the particular torn quality of the grain it left behind in the field. By 16, she could set a reel-to-cutter timing from the sound of the mechanism alone, with her back turned. The young men who came calling in the years that followed found themselves facing a woman who could ask them technical questions they had no satisfying answers to, whose gaze held the measuring quality of someone accustomed to diagnosing problems rather than accommodating them. One by one they stopped coming, and Ottoline did not grieve their absence in any way she could identify. Her world was the repair shed, the rhythm of the county's planting and harvest seasons, and the intricate, beautiful coherence of machinery when it was running as intended. Gerhard Brecht died of pneumonia in February of 1879, in a winter that was uncharitable even by central Illinois standards. The men of the county assumed the shed would close. A woman running a heavy implement repair operation was outside the category of things they believed in. the way they did not believe in warm winters or honest auctioneers. They were wrong about the shed as they were wrong about the other things. Ottoline, 36 years old, opened the doors the morning after her father was buried and took in the first waiting repair job before the ground above him had fully settled. For 7 years she ran the operation on the terms the county grudgingly accepted. She was the woman you went to when your old McCormick threw a knife section on a Saturday afternoon and the dealer in Springfield was 3 days away. She was reliable. She was meticulous. She was in the private assessments of the men who used her services, unnervingly good at her work. But reliable and meticulous were not the same as understood. They saw a fixture, a tolerated oddity. They did not see what was actually happening inside the shed after the customers left and the lamp went down to a single yellow pool over her father's old desk. In 1871, 8 years before Gerhardt died, a McCormick Company representative had come down from Springfield to service a demonstration model that had been lent to a county farmer for evaluation. He was a distracted man, efficient in the particular way of men who have too many appointments and not enough patience, and when he finished his work and climbed back into his wagon, he left on Gerhardt's workbench a volume he had been consulting during the service call. It was the McCormick Harvester and Binder Technical Service Manual, the 1871 edition, printed for distribution to authorized dealership mechanics only, and not available through any commercial channel. The manual contained specifications, tolerances, adjustment procedures, and diagnostic sequences that no independent repair shop in central Illinois was supposed to possess. Gerhardt found it when the wagon was already out of sight down the road, and he put it in the locked bottom drawer of his desk without ever writing to Springfield about it. He was a German immigrant with a craftsman's instinct for useful things, and this was a very useful thing. When Ottoline found the drawer after her father's death, the manual was there alongside 4 other volumes and a small envelope of letters from his brother in Ohio. She read it over the following winter with the methodical attention she brought to everything that mattered, not quickly, not excitedly, but with the patient thoroughness of a woman who understood that some kinds of knowledge take time to become the right shape inside you. Over the years that followed, she read it alongside her father's ledger, and the combination of those two texts, one describing how the machines were supposed to behave, the other documenting all the specific ways they actually failed in the fields of Cass County, produced an understanding of McCormick equipment that no authorized dealer's mechanic was likely to match, because the dealer's mechanic knew the manual but not the county, and the county farmers knew their fields but not the machine. What the community of Cass County did not know, could not have known from their vantage point at the cedar fence, was that Ottoline had begun thinking about the Chandlerville seizure yard long before any of those 9 machines arrived in it. She had watched them move through the local economy the way a physician watches a population move through a predictable sequence of conditions purchased new on borrowed money, operated by men who were skilled at farming but not at the maintenance of complex machinery, degraded by habits the ledger had named and predicted, traded or abandoned or eventually seized for unpaid debts. She had seen 6 of the 9 machines in her shed before they ended up in that yard. 3 others she recognized from her father's entries. The 9th was unknown to her, and she priced it accordingly. 2 weeks before the auction, Ottoline drove her wagon to Chandlerville and asked Aldous Fenn-Greaves for permission to inspect the equipment. He granted it immediately, with the relieved enthusiasm of a man who had been trying to move something immovable for over a year and would grant almost any request that might result in the problem becoming someone else's. She walked the line of machines alone, carrying no tools, bringing only the ledger and 15 years of accumulated attention. She moved slowly, touching the machines the way a person touches something familiar encountered in an unexpected place with recognition rather than curiosity. She found the weld her father had made on the frame of the 3rd machine, a repair recorded in the ledger for $1,874. She ran her thumb along a particular stress mark on the knife guard of the 7th that matched her father's written description of damage caused by an operator who had driven too fast through a stand of lodged grain and blamed the equipment for the consequence. 8 of the 9 machines were not strangers. They were patients with documented histories, and she already knew, from those histories, the specific location of each one's recurring failure. The 9th machine she inspected more carefully because it was the only one she could not place. The wooden reel fingers were cracked in a pattern consistent with prolonged high-speed operation in light crop conditions and operator's choice, not a manufacturing flaw. The knife section showed replacement work done by someone who had matched the size, but not the grade of the original rivets, which meant the sections would loosen under vibration faster than the original assembly. Neither problem was catastrophic. What concerned her was a deflection in the straw spreader housing that suggested the main drive shaft had at some point absorbed a lateral impact. She spent 20 minutes with her hand pressed against the housing, feeling the shape of it. She wrote a single notation in her own small journal. $1 for that machine, she decided. The risk was known and priced. The other $42 covered the 8 she understood completely. The cash she carried to the auction the following fortnight had been saved over 7 years of running the shed alone, set aside in a tin box kept under the floorboards of the shed rather than in the Chandlerville bank, because Ottoline had her father's German immigrant instinct about institutions that held other people's money. $43. Every cent of it placed with the deliberate calm of someone not gambling but completing a calculation that had been running for 15 years. Aldous Fengreaves counted the bills twice. She drove back to Ashland with her receipt in her coat pocket and the weight of what she had committed to settling around her like weather. The work of moving 9 pieces of heavy farm equipment 12 miles from Chandlerville to Ashland was not work that could be hired out, because hiring it out would have cost more than she had paid for the machines. Crispin Volker solved that problem by arriving at her shed door on a Thursday morning in early November, 6 days after the auction. He was 16 years old, lean and tall in the way of boys who have grown faster than they intended, with the careful eyes of someone who had been watching the world with more attention than he had yet found a use for. He was the son of a distant cousin on her mother's side, a Volker from the property 8 miles north, and he had heard about the auction the same way everyone in the county had heard about it, through the running commentary of people who found it instructive. Unlike most of them, what he found instructive was not the apparent foolishness of the purchase, but the fact that she had done it at all, which suggested she knew something they didn't. She offered him 25 cents a day and a noon meal. He accepted before she finished the sentence. For 11 days, they became a familiar and peculiar sight on the back roads of Cass County, Ottoline, driving her father's old freight wagon with its reinforced axles, Crispin steering a dead harvester being towed behind on chains, the massive equipment swaying and lurching over the frozen ruts of the county road with the unhurried dignity of something that had never been in a hurry and saw no reason to start now. They could manage 1 machine per day, starting before the frost lifted and finishing after the thin November dark had closed in around them. They communicated largely through gesture, developing a vocabulary of hand signals over the first 2 days that covered the necessary terrain. Stop, slower. The chain is drifting left. We need to rest the horses. They did not talk much beyond the requirements of the work, which suited both of them. By the second week of December, all 9 machines stood in a line behind the shed. Ottoline painted a white number on each one with a small brush, 1 through 9, standing on a wooden step stool in the gray afternoon light, with the paint freezing slightly on the brush between applications. Crispin watched her number them and understood without being told that this was a system, that the numbers meant an order, that she had already decided how this was going to proceed. The real work began in January of 1887, in a cold that made the shed creak at night and kept the water in the horse trough skimmed with ice by morning despite the linseed rags she packed around the bottom. The single wood stove in the corner threw adequate heat in a radius of about 8 feet and indifferent warmth beyond that. They worked in coats until mid-morning, when the stove had been burning long enough to make coats optional. She began with machine number 2, the old Hegmuth equipment, a family from the eastern edge of the county, whose name appeared in her father's ledger 4 separate times between 1868 and 1877. The teardown was a ritual of deliberate patience. Every fastener that came off the machine went into a labeled tin. Crispin had found a supply of them in the back of the shed. Tobacco cans and dried goods tins with their labels gone pale after being cleaned in a bath of linseed oil and inspected for thread condition. Ottoline showed him the difference between a thread that was stripped and a thread that was merely dirty. She showed him what a stress fracture looked like in cast iron under lamplight, the way it caught the light differently from a surface scratch, a faint bright line in the gray metal that meant the piece had been carrying more than it was designed to carry for longer than it should have. She did not lecture, she pointed and asked questions. What do you see here? What do you feel when you put your thumb on that surface? What does that sound like compared to this one? The ledger stayed open on the workbench, held flat against the curve of its own spine by a large wrench laid across its lower third. When they reached a component that her father had noted, she read the entry aloud. It was not sentiment, it was data. The Hegmuth machine's knife drive had been shimmed at the pivot by her father in the spring of 1873 because the original casting had worn slightly off-center, and the shim needed to be there or the drive would run eccentrically and fatigue the pitman arm at an accelerated rate. The shim was still there, corroded green, exactly where her father had placed it 14 years earlier. Crispin held the lamp while she photographed the assembly in her memory. The first significant mechanical obstacle arrived in the 3rd week of January. They were attempting to remove the reel drive shaft assembly from machine number 2 when a critical fastener on the main bracket proved immovable. It had been installed with the kind of aggressive torque that men apply when they are uncertain whether something will hold, and decide that if tighter is good, then as tight as possible must be better, and the years and the moisture and the galvanic reaction between the fastener and the casting had done the rest. A 4-foot breaker bar applied with Crispin's full weight produced a sound but no movement. He came off it red in the face and breathing hard. It's fused. The words came out slightly louder than he intended in the cold shed. There's nothing left to turn. Ottoline did not respond with either reassurance or alarm. She wiped her hands on a red flannel rag and walked to the back of the shed, returning with her father's ledger and the charcoal brazier Gerhardt had used since the shed's first decade, a heavy iron pan on legs, fed with hardwood charcoal and governed by a small bellows mounted on an articulated arm, so the heat could be directed without burning everything around it. She opened the ledger on the clean section of the workbench and found the Hegmuth entry for 1,873. There was a marginal notation in pencil, smaller than the main text, that she read aloud to Crispin without preamble. Heat to cherry color. Beeswax at the thread. Cheater on the wrench. It will release. She looked at him across the bench. He was here before us. He left us the answer. She lit the charcoal, worked the bellows until the coals glowed, then held the brazier close to the metal surrounding the fastener in slow, patient passes, watching the color change through the steel until it reached the dull red she wanted. Then she touched a block of beeswax to the hot metal at the thread line and watched the wax liquefy and wick down into the joint, carrying its lubricating property into a space no penetrating oil would have reached. She fitted a 6-point socket, attached a length of heavy steel pipe to the wrench handle for leverage, and leaned her weight into it with steady, even pressure, not a jerk, not a sudden application of force, but the long, gradual pressure of someone who has been told the answer and is simply executing it. The fastener released with a groan. This sounded like the protest of something that had been fixed in place for a very long time and had forgotten it was supposed to move. It was a small thing. In the cold January shed with the stove ticking behind them, it felt like a conversation with someone who had been silent for 8 years. The method they established over the following weeks had the quality of a practice. Each morning began with the ledger, identifying what her father had documented about the machine currently on the bench, so they were never working blind into territory he had already mapped. Each component came off in sequence, cleaned, inspected, labeled, stored. Each failure was diagnosed against the manual specifications and cross-referenced against the ledger's field observations, because the manual told her what the machine was designed to tolerate, and the ledger told her what the farms of Cass County had actually asked it to endure, and those two things were not always the same number. The knife section alignment was the first technical skill she transferred to Crispin in any systematic way. The McCormick cutter bar required its knife sections to run in precise alignment with the guards. The manual specified a tolerance of 1/32 of an inch across the full width of the bar, which on a standard machine meant maintaining that tolerance over nearly 5 feet of reciprocating mechanism. The brass straight edge her father had made for this purpose lived in a felt-lined slot in his main toolbox, and she brought it out with the care she brought to things that were irreplaceable. She showed Crispin how to lay it across the guards, how to read the light gap beneath it, how to feel with his thumb the difference between a section that was correctly seated and one that was proud by even the smallest fraction. She had him run the test on 3 different machines before she confirmed he was reading it correctly. He was. Real timing was more difficult to transmit because it required the ability to hear something that took years to learn, to hear the particular quality of the crop engagement sound that indicated the reel was advancing the standing grain into the cutter at precisely the right moment relative to the cutter's stroke. Her father had written about it in the ledger with the frustration of a man trying to describe music in words. The best he had managed was a note from 1,874. Reel speed against travel speed. The grain should fall to the knife, not be pushed into it and not be left behind it. When it is right, the machine sounds like it is thinking. Ottoline read this to Crispin on a gray February afternoon, and he was quiet for a moment. "That's not a measurement," he said finally. "That's something you know or you don't." She looked at him. "Most of what matters is." By February, they had completed the full teardown of machines 2 and 3. The pile of worn and failed components growing outside the shed's side door had begun to take on a geographic quality. Belts that had stretched past specification coiled in one area, knife sections that had worn below the minimum land width in another, wooden reel fingers cracked by years of impact stacked along the shed wall. Each failed part was a record of the machine's history, the accumulated evidence of how it had been run and what it had been asked to do beyond its design. Ottoline looked at that pile differently than Crispin did. He saw waste. She saw documentation. It was in the 4th week of February that Crispin found the thing she had not expected him to find. She had sent him to begin the preliminary inspection of machine number 6, while she completed the valve adjustment on number 3's threshing mechanism. When she crossed the shed 2 hours later to check his progress, she found him not at machine 6 but at the workbench, bent over a sheet of drawing paper with a pencil in his hand. He had drawn the internal arrangement of the knife drive assembly from machine 2 in cross-section, with dimensions noted at the critical points, and a small notation in the margin that read "shimmed here, original casting worn off center, pitman fatigue risk if shim removed." The drawing was precise. It was also entirely in his own notation system, using symbols and proportional sketching rather than the written descriptions her father had favored, because Crispin's eye was better than his pen, and he had adapted the method to his own capacity without being told to. Ottoline stood behind him for a moment he was not aware of. Then she said, "Without inflection, you made your own ledger." He turned around, not entirely certain whether this was a reprimand. She picked up the drawing and examined it. "This is better for certain purposes than written description." She set it back down. Keep doing this. One drawing for each critical assembly on every machine. Label the machine number and the date. She returned to machine 3 without further comment, and Crispin understood, with the particular clarity that comes from the absence of ceremony, that something had shifted between them that was not going to shift back. The days lengthened toward spring. The stove still ran in the mornings. Pile outside the shed door grew. The tins of labeled fasteners accumulated along the shelf her father had built, along the east wall of the shed in approximately 1862. Their handwritten paper labels lined up with the small precision of something organized by a person who expected the organization to matter later. Ottoline worked by a rule she had never articulated but had followed since she opened the shed after her father's funeral. The machine tells you what it needs, if you are willing to be quiet enough to hear it. Most mechanics she had observed over the years were not willing. They brought an answer to the machine and looked for the place where it fit. She brought a question. The difference in outcome was significant and consistent, and it was documented across 21 years of a cloth-bound ledger that was now holding open on her workbench in the shed in Ashland, Illinois, getting more use in 1887 than it had seen since its author died. On the last day of March, with 6 inches of late snow on the ground outside and the wood stove burning well, she was alone in the shed when she finished the final adjustment on machine number 2's threshing, concave, the curved grate that separated grain from chaff inside the threshing cylinder, the component where the difference between a good harvest and a damaged one was measured in fractions of an inch. The factory specification from the 1871 manual called for a clearance of 1/2 inch at the front of the concave, tapering to 1/8 at the rear, but the ledger told a more complicated story. Her father had devoted 4 pages to concave adjustment in varying crop conditions, the kind of operational knowledge that was earned in fields across decades and could not be derived from any specification document. Heimsmoisture wheat in heavy stand-open rear clearance to 3/16 or the cylinder cracks. Every third kernel, he had written in the summer entry of 1872. Dry oats in late season close to 1/16 at rear and watch the cylinder speed. The machine will tell you when the clearance is right by the sound of the straw in the walkers. Listen for even flow, and even means the concave is restricting. She had read that passage to Crispin twice. The second time, she set the ledger down and told him that the manual gave him the number and the field gave him the truth, and any mechanic who had only one of those two things was operating with half the information and getting half the results. She made a brief entry in her own ledger. Machine 2, concave set. Cylinder bearing check next morning. The handwriting was smaller than her father's, more compressed, but it had his quality of recording fact without sentiment, of treating the machine's history as a record worth keeping because accuracy was worth keeping, because the truth of a thing mattered even when the truth was inconvenient, even when the truth was something a county full of men standing at a cedar fence had already decided they did not need to know. She closed the ledger. She banked the stove for the night. She turned down the lamp. Outside in the early April darkness of Cass County, Illinois, 8 machines were still waiting. The cylinder-bearing check on machine number 2 revealed a problem she had not anticipated, which was its own kind of information. The outer race of the main threshing cylinder bearing had developed a flat spot not from impact, but from the particular kind of damage that comes from a machine sitting idle for too long in conditions of moderate moisture, where the bearing's weight rests against the same point of the race for months and the steel yields, imperceptibly, to the patient pressure of its own stillness. It was not visible to the eye. It was audible, a faint periodicity in the rotation, a sound that recurred at exactly the interval of one full cylinder revolution and nowhere else. She found it on a Tuesday morning in early April, by turning the cylinder by hand with her ear 6 inches from the housing, her eyes closed, counting the revolutions until the pattern repeated. Crispin had been watching her do this for 2 minutes before he understood what she was listening for. Is it bad? The question came out smaller than he intended. She turned the cylinder back half a revolution and held it. It will fail in the field inside 40 acres. She released the cylinder and straightened, which means it fails in someone's harvest. That's when bad becomes expensive. The bearing required replacement, and replacement meant a specific part from a supplier who stocked McCormick components, which meant a letter to a firm on Adams Street in Peoria whose catalog she had kept current for 9 years. She wrote the letter that afternoon and sent Crispin to post it in Chandlerville the following morning, before the frost had finished melting off the road. While they waited, she moved to machine number 3. Number 3 was the equipment she remembered most clearly from her father's ledger, a McCormick that had belonged to a family named Westergaard, who had farmed 300 acres in the southern part of the county through most of the 1870s before the oldest son sold the property and moved the family to Kansas, following a succession dispute that the county had found entertaining for approximately 2 years. Her father had serviced this machine 5 times between 1869 and 1878, and his entries for it were among the most detailed in the ledger, because the Westergaard equipment had been well used, and the Westergaard men had been the kind of farmers who pushed their machinery to its edges and were then puzzled when the edges gave way. Gerhardt had been patient with them in his entries in the way he was patient with recurrence, describing the same failure and its same cause in the same careful language each time. The repetition itself a form of documentation. He had been less patient in the margins. The third machine's primary issue was in the canvas elevator, the angled conveyor that carried threshed grain from the concave area up into the grain tank. The canvas had cracked across 3 of its wooden slats and was missing an eighth of its width on the left side where the edge had frayed through. It would carry grain, but inefficiently, spilling 5 to 8% of what passed over it back into the straw walkers to be discharged with the waste. Her father had written about this specific failure in 1876 with a brevity that suggested exasperation. Canvas gone at left margin again. Third time. Told Westergaard to run slower in heavy crop and the canvas will last. He will not run slower, he will buy new canvas. The canvas replacement required sourcing the correct grade of duck canvas in the width the machine required, because the standard commercial grade available at the Ashland General Store was lighter than the McCormick specification and would degrade in the same place within 2 seasons of the same use. She added the correct grade canvas to the order she had already dispatched to Peoria. The bearing for Machine 2 arrived 11 days later, packed in oiled paper inside a pine box. She inspected it under the lamp before doing anything else, turning it in her hands and running the rotation test her father had taught her. A good bearing, correctly ground, produced a sound like very fine sand moving in a tin. This one was correct. She drove the old race out of the housing with a brass drift punch to protect the housing bore, pressed the new bearing in with the arbor press her father had built in 1869 from a description in a mechanical trades journal, and had machine number 2's threshing cylinder back in place by mid-afternoon. She turned the cylinder by hand. No periodicity. The sound was clean. She made the entry in her ledger with 2 lines and a date and moved back to machine 3. April became May without making a particular point of the transition. The prairie light shifted. The mornings came earlier, and the roads dried enough that the county traffic returned to normal volume on the lane outside the shed. Crispin arrived each morning at the same time, departed each evening at the same time, and in between accumulated the kind of knowledge that does not announce itself, but simply becomes present: the difference between cast iron and wrought iron, by the weight of a component in the hand. The way a properly tensioned drive chain sounded against a sprocket versus one that was running slightly long. How to read the color of metal coming out of a solvent bath to assess whether the cleaning was finished or whether another cycle was needed. He drew everything. The drawings accumulated in a folder made from a piece of pasteboard salvaged from a shipping crate, and by May the folder was thick enough that it had to be held shut with a length of twine. One afternoon, Ottoline took the folder from its place on the shelf and went through it while he was cleaning components at the other end of the bench. She spent perhaps 20 minutes with it, turning pages, occasionally tilting a drawing toward the window light for a better angle. When she set it back on the shelf, she said, without turning around, "The proportions on the concave drawings are better than the manuals." He looked up from the parts he was cleaning. She had already gone back to what she was doing. He understood that this was as close as she came to a specific compliment, and he treated it accordingly. The problem with machine number 5 presented itself on an otherwise unremarkable morning in the 3rd week of that same month. They had worked through number 4, without significant difficulty, a worn pitman arm, a cracked wobble box casting that required a replacement from Peoria, and a reel that had been reassembled at some earlier point by someone who had managed to invert one of the bat sections, producing a rotation that technically turned but delivered the crop at an angle inconsistent with the knife section's geometry. Machine number 5 was the portable steam thresher, the separate power unit that provided the rotational force the McCormick harvester's threshing mechanism required in field operation, connected to the harvester by a long leather belt run between the 2 machines. The steam threshers were the most mechanically complex pieces in the set, and she had reserved 2 of them for later in the sequence deliberately, wanting the experience accumulated on the simpler harvester repairs to inform her approach to the more demanding equipment. The preliminary inspection of number 5's firebox went as she expected: some scale buildup on the interior surfaces, a cracked fire brick on the left rear that would need replacement, a safety valve that showed signs of having been bypassed at some point by a previous owner who had either not understood its function or understood it entirely and made a different calculation about acceptable risk. She noted each item and was reaching to reposition the lamp for a better angle on the upper firebox interior when she saw it. The crack was on the inside surface of the boiler drum, above the waterline, in a location not visible from any external inspection point. It ran approximately 4 inches along the grain of the metal at a shallow angle, wider at the center than at the ends, with the particular character of a fatigue crack that had been developing slowly over years of thermal cycling, rather than forming suddenly under a single overload event. It was not dramatic in appearance. It was precise and quiet and irreversible, and it meant that this machine, if returned to steam service without addressing it, was not simply unreliable, it was dangerous in the specific way that pressurized vessels with structural compromises are dangerous, which is to say completely and without adequate warning. She held the lamp close and looked at the crack for a long time. The shed was quiet around her. She looked at it again to be certain of what she was seeing. Then she set the lamp on the floor of the firebox and sat down on the wooden step stool she used for high-clearance work and did not move for a very long time. Crispin found her there 90 minutes later when he came to ask a question about a fitting on Machine 6's drivetrain. He stopped in the doorway of the firebox access and looked at her face and did not ask his question. He had been working alongside her for 5 months, long enough to understand the difference between the stillness she maintained as a matter of general practice and the stillness that meant something had changed. This was the second kind. She climbed down from the step stool and showed him the crack, guiding the lamp to the correct angle, and told him what it meant in plain words. He looked at it carefully. He said what she had already said to herself an hour earlier. The number for a replacement drum was too large, more than 4 times what she had paid for all 9 machines combined. Can we weld it? The question was practical, which was what she needed from him at that moment. From inside at that angle, the weld would introduce stress at the heat-affected zone around the repair. She did not need to finish the statement. He understood the implication that a weld repair in that location, on metal of that age and condition, might defer the problem rather than solve it, and that deferring a problem in a pressurized vessel was not conservative practice. He was quiet. Outside the shed, a wagon was passing on the county road, the sound of the horse's hooves on the packed earth clear in the spring air. Then he said, "We can't afford to buy a drum, no, so what do we do?" She picked up her ledger from the step stool where she had set it. She had been reading while she sat, not for comfort, but because her father's voice in those pages was the clearest thinking she had access to when her own thinking needed steadying. She had found, in the entries for 1,875, a notation she had not remembered being there. A brief description of a crack repair on a different piece of pressurized equipment, a steam-driven corn sheller belonging to a farm north of Chandlerville, where Gerhardt had been faced with a similar problem and had resolved it not through repair of the existing component, but through replacement sourced from an unexpected supplier. He had written the supplier's name in the margin in a hand smaller than his usual notation, as though he were not entirely certain the information would remain relevant, but wanted to record it anyway. Renner and Cobb Iron Foundry, Beardstown. Beardstown was 18 miles north. She had driven past the foundry's yard twice in her life. The idea did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a slow clarification, the way a diagnosis sometimes presents itself through the gradual accumulation of evidence pointing in one direction. She did not have the money for a drum. She did have something that Renner and Cobb Foundry almost certainly did not have: a technically precise set of dimensions, material specifications, and fabrication requirements for a McCormick steam thresher boiler drum, drawn from an authorized service manual that no independent foundry in central Illinois would have had routine access to. The manual told her the exact drum diameter, wall thickness, material grade, head geometry, and working pressure specification. A foundry with the capability to produce the component would need exactly that information to make it correctly. Without it, they would be estimating, and estimated pressurized vessels were another way of describing the kind of risk she was not willing to accept in equipment that her customers would operate. She wrote the letter to Renner and Cobb that evening at her father's desk, by lamplight, with the lamp turned up high so she could write precisely. She described what she had, what she was proposing, what she would offer in exchange for the work at materials cost. She offered them the right to retain a copy of the relevant manual sections for future orders. She was asking them to do skilled foundry work for the cost of the iron because she was giving them something they would use again. And she made that case in plain language without apology or elaboration. Then she went back to machines 6 and 7. There was a particular discipline required for this period, between the discovery of the crack and the foundry's response, that she had not anticipated needing to cultivate. The discipline was to continue working, at full attention, on problems that were solvable with available resources, while carrying an unsolved problem that was not yet solved and might not be solved in the way she preferred. She had not been trained in this discipline explicitly. She had been trained by the years after her father died, by the mornings when she opened the shed, and the next job waiting was beyond what she had done before, and she did it anyway, and wrote down what she learned. The discipline was already in her. The crack had simply required her to apply it at a higher register. Machine 6 carried a problem in its grain elevator distinct from the canvas failure on Machine 3. The wooden slats themselves had been replaced at some previous point by slats of a slightly different dimension. Not different enough to be immediately apparent, but different enough to alter the elevator's carrying efficiency by a measurable amount. Whoever had made the repair had used available stock rather than specification stock, which was understandable and wrong in equal measure. She ordered correct dimension slats from Peoria and replaced the substandard ones, with the attention of someone who understood that small inaccuracies in components compound into large inaccuracies in outcomes. Machine 7 was the one that made Crispin stop drawing and simply watch. The reel on number 7 had at some point been subjected to a lateral impact, the kind of force that results from a machine driven at speed into an obstruction that does not yield, a rock or a root or a section of old fence line swallowed by the grass at a field edge. The impact had bent the main reel axle by a degree and a half from true and visible to the eye in an unmoving machine, apparent only when the reel turned, when the slight precession of the damaged axle caused the entire reel assembly to describe a slow ellipse rather than a true circle. Straightening a bent reel axle without access to a machine lathe required applying controlled heat to the correct location and using a known reference surface to confirm the correction. The reference surface was the flat granite stone her father had acquired for exactly this class of problem, a piece of polished granite 12 inches square that lived wrapped in oilcloth on the bottom shelf of the main toolbox. She heated the metal at the correct point using the brazier and bellows, established the reference, made the correction in 3 incremental applications to avoid overshooting the true position, and verified the result by spinning the reassembled reel by hand and watching its outer edge against a stretched string she had fixed to the frame. The ellipse was gone, the rotation was true. Crispin had stopped drawing partway through and had been watching with his arms folded across his chest. How did you know where to heat it? She was still watching the reel turn. The bend starts where the force was absorbed. The metal deformed from that point outward. You heat where the deformation begins, not where it's most visible. She stopped the reel with her hand. Where the damage looks worst is usually downstream of where the damage started. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see that he was applying this to something beyond the reel axle. She let him apply it. The response from Renner and Cobb arrived on a Friday morning 3 weeks after she had sent the letter. She came out from under Machine 8's cutter bar assembly with oil on her forearms and read the letter standing up. Renner and Cobb had consulted with their senior foundry man. They were prepared to undertake the drum. They accepted her terms. They would need the dimensional specifications she had described, and approximately 6 to 8 weeks of fabrication time once they had the information in hand. Their senior man had added a handwritten note at the bottom, seen 3 of these cracks in the field. All on older drums run too hard for too long. Your repair approach is correct. The weld would have failed. Bring the specs. She drove to Beardstown the following Monday with the relevant sections of the McCormick manual copied out in her own hand onto good paper, the dimensions verified twice against the manual and once against her own measurements of the damaged drum. She met with the senior foundry man, whose name was Royce, and spent 2 hours with him at the foundry's drafting table, going through the specifications with the focused mutual attention of 2 people who understood the same thing from different directions and were finding the overlap. He asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. When they finished, he looked at the specifications for a moment and said, without any particular inflection, "This is dealership-grade documentation." She told him it was. He did not ask how she had come to have it. The 6 to 8 weeks of fabrication time meant returning to Ashland and working on machines 8 and 9 in a state of provisional planning. She knew machine 5 could not be completed until the drum arrived, but she could complete everything around the drum and be ready to install it immediately upon its arrival. This was not inefficiency. It was sequencing, the same skill that organized a harvest operation, where you did not wait for perfect conditions, but structured your work around the constraints you could not yet resolve, and built readiness into the time the constraint required. Machine 8 was the one that had belonged to a family she could not place, no entry in her father's ledger, no name she recognized from the county's farming operations. She had priced it at $7 to account for the additional diagnostic uncertainty. The uncertainty proved justified. Where the other machines had failed in patterns she could cross-reference against the ledger, Machine 8's failures were undocumented and required straightforward systematic diagnosis going through each system in the sequence the manual established. Testing function, identifying variance from specification, determining cause. It was slower than working from known history, and it reminded her of why the ledger had value that could not be replicated by any amount of technical specification knowledge alone. The manual told her how it was supposed to work. The ledger told her how it had actually been used. Without the ledger, she was working with half the information, exactly as she had told Crispin. Machine number 9 she had been thinking about since the day in the Chandlerville yard, when she had pressed her palm against the straw spreader housing and felt the shape of the deflection under it. The teardown confirmed the deflection's source. The main drive shaft had absorbed a lateral impact more severe than the one on Machine 7, and the consequence was not in the shaft itself, but in the drive shaft bearing housing, which had cracked at the casting flange. The crack had been filled at some point with a lead-based filler that had been painted over, rendering it invisible to any inspection that did not involve physically feeling the surface under the paint. The filler would hold the housing together under static conditions. Under the dynamic loading of field operation, it would fail at a time and in a manner that was difficult to predict. The housing could not be repaired. It needed to be replaced. She opened the McCormick manual to the appendix she had read many times, but now needed in a specific way the list of authorized equipment modification suppliers who had worked with McCormick designs through the early 1880s. Most of the names on the list were large suppliers in Chicago or Cincinnati, whose catalogs she already knew, and who would not stock a bearing housing for an 1,000 883 variant production run of a machine that had been manufactured in limited quantities for a regional market. But there was one name, added in pen in the margin of the appendix page by her father at some point she could not date precisely, with a question mark beside it, Kettleworth Farm Equipment, Galesburg, Illinois. She wrote the letter with less certainty than she had written to Renner and Cobb. She described the component, the machine variant, the year of manufacture, specific casting dimensions she required. She sent it without knowing whether Kettleworth was still in operation, whether they had ever stocked such a component, whether the lead time would put the machine out of the current repair sequence entirely. The reply arrived in 19 days. Kettleworth was operating. They had produced components for the 1883 variant under a direct arrangement with McCormick's engineering office. They had a bearing housing in inventory. The price was $19. Crispin read the letter over her shoulder and was quiet for a moment. The name was in the manual, in the appendix. How long have you known it was there? She set the letter on the bench and picked up her pencil to write the return order. Since I read the appendix. She paused with the pencil above the paper. The appendix was the first section I read. I always begin with the back of a book. That is where the things they almost didn't include are kept. He looked at her for a moment. And the $1 bid on that machine was a decision made with available information. She began writing the order. The housing was the worst reasonable outcome. I priced it for the worst reasonable outcome. He took this in the way he took most things she told him, not immediately, but completely. The Renner and Cobb drum arrived on a Tuesday in late July, packed in a wooden crate lined with sawdust. The drum was correct. She could see it in the first minute of inspection. The proportions matched the manual specifications. The surface finish was what the foundry's capabilities could produce and what the application required. The head geometry was what she had drawn on the copied sheets she had brought to Royce in Beardstown. She did the fit check against the boiler shell, and the flange dimensions held to within what she could measure with the tools she had. Royce had enclosed a brief note. Drum is correct. Pressure test to 1. 5 working pressure before service. Do not skip the test. She had not intended to skip the test. The installation of the new drum into Machine 5's boiler shell was precise work that required full attention and half a day. She fitted the drum, made the head connections, ran the hydraulic pressure test by filling the shell with water and applying pressure with a hand pump until the gauge read 1.5 times the working pressure specification, then held that pressure for 30 minutes while she moved around the boiler with her hand flat against every joint and seam, feeling for weeping. Nothing wept. The drum was sound. She released the pressure, drained the water, dried the interior with a careful application of low coals from the brazier held at a safe distance, and began reassembly. By the middle of August, Machine 5 was complete. The Kettleworth housing for Machine 9 arrived in the first week of September. She had the machine's drive shaft assembly ready and waiting, cleaned and inspected and staged on the bench in the sequence she would use for reinstallation, because staging the sequence before the part arrived meant the installation could proceed without delay once it did. The housing fit the shaft bore correctly. She installed it that afternoon and painted the bearing housing the same red as the rest of the machine. In late October of 1888, 2 years and 8 days after she had driven her wagon out of the Chandlerville seizure yard, with a carbon copy receipt in her inside pocket, Ottoline climbed onto the operator's platform of machine number 2 in the cold morning air and reached for the starting mechanism with the quiet, deliberate movement of someone who has prepared for a specific moment for a long time and has decided not to perform it. Crispin stood to the side with a bucket of sand, the correct precaution for a machine being started for the first time after extensive work, because first starts were when unexpected things revealed themselves, and unexpected things near combustion required fast responses. His face was composed in a way that indicated he was working at composure. The mechanism engaged. The machine turned over once, found compression on the second revolution, and caught with the particular sound of a well-built machine running at its correct specification, not the labored, rattling sound of a worn mechanism operating beyond its tolerances, but the clean, even sound of components moving in the relationships they were designed to maintain, each part doing what it was supposed to do at the moment it was supposed to do it. No irregular vibration, no evidence of misalignment. The reel turned true. The knife section reciprocated without hesitation. The elevator ran. She listened for 2 full minutes. Not because she needed 2 minutes, she had her answer in the first 15 seconds, but because she wanted to be certain that what she was hearing was what she thought she was hearing, and not what she wanted to hear. They were the same thing. She shut the machine down, stepped off the platform, opened her ledger, and wrote the entry for machine number 2. Crispin exhaled. The sound was quiet and genuine, the release of something he had not been entirely aware he was holding. She looked at him for a moment with the even attention she brought to things she wanted to see clearly. 8 more, she said. He picked up the bucket of sand and moved it to the position it would need to occupy for machine number 3. By November, 5 of the 9 machines had been started, confirmed, and entered into her ledger. Machine 7's reel, whose axle she had straightened in the spring, ran true from the first rotation. Machine 8 started on its third attempt, the slight hesitation consistent with a machine whose fuel system she had fully rebuilt and needed one extra cycle to prime correctly. She noted this, confirmed it resolved itself in normal operation, and logged it as unremarkable. Machine 9 was the last. She started it on a still afternoon in the final week of November, with the temperature dropping and the light already going thin in the way of late Illinois autumn. The new Kettleworth housing turned on the shaft without the tremor she had been prepared to feel and did not feel. The drive engaged cleanly, the machine ran. She did not make a ceremony of it. She made a ledger entry. That evening, after Crispin had gone and the shed was quiet, she walked the line of all 9 machines in the early dark, touching each one at a point she had worked on: a bearing housing, a knife guard, a reel bat, the seam of a repaired elevator canvas. The line was uniform in a way that had not been true of the line she had inspected in the Chandlerville yard 2 years earlier, the uniform red of their refreshed paint standing even in the dim light as evidence of the system that had produced them. Not 9 individual problems, but 9 applications of the same method. Not 9 gambles, but 9 predictions that had been tested against physical reality and confirmed. She walked to the end of the line and turned back and looked at all of them together. From the county road, through the autumn bare branches of the oak trees at the property edge, a neighbor's wagon passed with its lantern swinging. The driver slowed. She could see the pace change in the lantern's movement and then continued on, the light receding down the road toward Ashland. She could imagine what the driver saw: 9 old machines in a yard, Ottoline's Folly, all polished up. She could imagine the thought that would accompany the slowing and the resumed pace, the gentle, certain pity of someone who has decided they know the end of a story that hasn't ended yet. The evidence was not loud. It had not announced itself. It stood there in the November dark in the same patient register it had always maintained, waiting for the conditions that would make its nature apparent to anyone who cared to look. The conditions were not within her control. They would arrive when they arrived. She went inside. The winter of 1888 into 1889 carried a different quality than any winter she had worked through. Since her father died, not the silence of loss and not the silence of waiting, but the silence of a thing brought to its finished state and now resting in the dark for the season that would require it. She used the months to service what had been serviced, to check what had been checked, to move through the 9 machines in sequence with the same methodical attention she had brought to their restoration, because maintenance was not a different activity from repair, but the same activity applied before the failure rather than after it. She replaced a knife section on machine 4 that showed early wear at the rivet hole, changed the lubricant in 3 bearing housings she had noted as candidates for early service, adjusted the concave clearance on machine 6 that had settled 0.02 from the setting she had established in the fall. These were small things. They were also exactly the things that, undone, became large things in the middle of a harvest when a customer was waiting. Crispin came 3 days a week through January and February, fewer than during the restoration because the work did not require daily presence, but enough to maintain his engagement with the machines and with the accumulating knowledge that the engagement produced. He was 17 now, grown further than seemed strictly necessary, with the economical movements of someone who had spent 2 years learning to work in a confined space without wasted motion. His folder of drawings had been replaced by a proper bound notebook, purchased with his own wages, whose pages were filling in the system he had developed, not her father's system, not the McCormick manual system, but the system that had emerged from the combination of both as filtered through his particular intelligence. She read through it occasionally without telling him she was doing so, and what she found there confirmed what she had understood since the afternoon. She found him at the workbench with the cross-section drawing. He was not learning her trade. He was developing his own version of it. In March, she began writing letters. The letters went to farms across Cass County and into Morgan County to the west and Schuyler County to the north, addressed to farmers she had served at the repair shed over the years. Farmers she knew to be operating on terms that could become difficult if conditions changed, farmers whose equipment she knew to be heavily financed. The letters were brief. They stated that Brecht Implement Repair was expanding its services to include custom harvesting operations for the 1889 and subsequent seasons, that the operation maintained 9 fully restored McCormick Marsh harvester sets in working condition, that availability was limited, and she was writing to establish clients first. She quoted a rate per acre, payable upon completion of each field, in cash, and she provided no credit terms because she had decided, with the clarity that came from 2 years of working without any credit herself, that credit in a harvest operation created a category of risk she was not willing to absorb on behalf of other people's optimism about the following season's prices. The responses were modest. 3 farmers replied with interest in the 1889 season, 2 from Cass County, 1 from the edge of Morgan County near Waverly. She scheduled their acreage, confirmed the arrangements by return letter, and began planning the logistics of moving equipment between farms with the same methodical attention she had applied to everything else in the preceding years. The 1889 harvest season was not a triumph. It was a proof. She ran 6 contracts that first season, adding 3 more in July when 2 of her original clients mentioned her services to neighbors whose equipment had broken down in the field with grain standing ripe and nowhere to go. She operated 4 of the 9 machines, keeping 5 in reserve not because she lacked operators, but because she had not yet developed the network of qualified men she would need to run the full fleet, and she was not willing to put equipment in the hands of people she had not observed enough to trust with it. The season's end found her with a modest return, more than she would have earned in the repair shed alone, enough to confirm the direction without yet confirming the scale. She identified the 2 operators she had hired, older men who had been farming their own land until debt and drought had taken it from them, as people whose mechanical instinct and field judgment she wanted to keep. She paid them well, not extravagantly well. There was a difference, and she was clear about which side of it she intended to operate on. The 1890 season expanded. The 1891 season expanded further. Each year the word moved through the county networks in the way that useful things move, not through advertisement or promotion, but through the direct testimony of farmers who had needed a harvest done and had gotten one done correctly. She ran 8 machines in 1891, still keeping one in reserve, still carrying the same per acre cash terms she had established at the beginning. Some farmers pushed back on the cash requirement. She was consistent. She had built her operation on 0 debt, and she was not going to acquire other people's debt through the back door of extended terms. If they needed to sell a portion of their standing crop to a grain dealer to have cash at field completion, she would tell them exactly how to do that, because the information was useful and she saw no reason to withhold it. In the summer of 1892, Lysander Quill Barrow came to Cass County for the first time. He was a reporter for the Illinois State Journal in Springfield, 31 years old, assigned to cover the agricultural conditions in the central counties as a series for the paper's fall edition. He was a farm boy from Sangamon County who had gone to the University of Illinois and come back with enough formal language to describe what he had always understood intuitively, which gave his agricultural reporting a quality of specific accuracy that readers recognized as real. He was in Chandlerville talking to the county agricultural office when someone mentioned, with the particular tone people use when they are mentioning something they have not entirely resolved in their own mind, that there was a woman in Ashland running a 9-machine custom harvesting operation out of an implement repair shed, that she had built the fleet from equipment purchased at a seizure auction for a sum so small the county officials still occasionally cited it as an example of how badly the seizure yard had been managed, and that she had been doing it for 3 seasons without borrowing a dollar. Barrow drove out to Ashland on a Tuesday afternoon in August, arriving to find the shed occupied with 2 of the machines undergoing scheduled maintenance between field operations, and Crispin Volker, now 22, directing a hired mechanic through the real timing adjustment on machine 6 with the focused, patient manner of someone who has explained a thing enough times to have developed an efficient explanation for it. Barrow introduced himself to the hired mechanic, who pointed him toward the back of the shed where Ottoline was inspecting the knife drive on machine 3. She did not look up when he entered. She was running her thumb along the knife sections in the sequence she used for wear assessment, feeling for the edge condition with a consistency of pressure that required attention. He waited. When she had finished the section she was on, she straightened and looked at him with the measuring attention she brought to new information. He told her who he was. She wiped her hands on the flannel rag she kept in her left coat pocket. "What do you want to know?" He had been intending to ease into it, the way he usually eased into interviews with farmers who were not accustomed to talking to reporters. He recognized immediately that easing in was not the correct approach here. "How many acres are you running this season?" asked Crispin. "He keeps the field schedule." She moved to machine 4. Barrow found Crispin at the back of machine 6. The field schedule lived in a bound ledger on the shelf above the workbench, organized by county and then by farm, with the acreage, crop type, and completion date for each contract entered in Crispin's distinctive notation. Barrow began reading through it. He was 3 pages in before he started counting, and he was 2 pages further before he stopped and looked at the total he had arrived at. He went back and counted again. He brought the ledger to Ottoline. "Is this current?" She glanced at the page, through last week. He had been doing agricultural reporting long enough to understand what the numbers meant in context, the per-acre rate she was charging, the average yield for this part of Illinois, the number of contracts, the number of harvest days in a season. He did the calculation in the margin of his own notebook in the shorthand arithmetic he had learned from his father, and the number he arrived at was large enough that he did it a second time to rule out an error. The second calculation produced the same number. "This season alone," he said carefully, "this is a 200,000 operation." She took the ledger from his hands and returned it to the shelf. Lysander. She had read his name from the card he had given her, and used it the way she used everything, directly, without ornament. "The grain is standing. My crew starts at first light. Write me a letter if you need more." He looked at the 9 machines in the line beyond the shed doors, the last of the late August light catching their red paint in the even, warm way of late-season afternoons. He had been in enough operations to recognize what he was looking at: the organization, the maintenance standards, the systematic approach to a problem that most people in the county had not recognized as solvable. He was also a farm boy from Sangamon County who understood what $43 meant and what 1,888 to 1,892 meant, and what 9 machines meant, and what no debt meant in a period when everyone around her was carrying more debt than their operations could support. He wrote what he had seen and what the numbers said. The piece ran in the Illinois State Journal in October, and it was reprinted in 3 other papers within a fortnight, each adding something to what the previous version had said, the way stories accrete detail when they pass through enough hands. By November, Ottoline Brecht Halversen of Ashland, Illinois, had been described in print as the most efficient custom harvesting operator in central Illinois. She read Barrow's original because Crispin had brought it to the shed and set it on her workbench, and she read it with the attention she brought to any document that described something she knew about, noting what was accurate and what was approximation. Most of it was accurate. She set it aside and went back to work. What the newspaper coverage changed was not her operation, but the origin of the inquiries that reached her. Before the Barrow piece, the people who contacted her were farmers who had heard from other farmers. After it, she began receiving letters from men she had never heard of, from counties she had never worked in, from agricultural societies and county extension offices who wanted to visit the shed and inspect the equipment. She answered the letters that were from farmers with fields and a genuine need for custom harvesting. She did not answer the others, not from discourtesy, but from the recognition that she had a finite amount of time and a clear sense of what it was for. The conditions that would test the operation's real meaning arrived in the spring of 1893. Not announced, not sudden, but with the slow, building quality of a structural failure that has been developing for years beneath a surface that looked sound. She had been watching the credit situation in the county since before she purchased the machines. The pattern was legible if you were paying attention and not invested in an optimistic interpretation of it. Land prices that had been rising since the late 1870s on the basis of borrowed money and anticipated yields, farm operations carrying debt loads that required grain prices to remain elevated to service, equipment financed on terms that looked reasonable when the interest rate was set and looked catastrophic when it adjusted. She had seen the individual expressions of this pattern in her father's ledger, and in her own years at the repair shed: the farmer who deferred a maintenance repair because money was tight, the one who pushed a machine past its specification because he couldn't afford to stop, the one who refinanced to buy a newer machine to improve his yields, and then couldn't make the payment on either the new machine or the land it was supposed to service. What she had not seen before, because it had not happened at this scale before, was all of those individual expressions converging simultaneously. The panic of 1893 was not a single event. It was the moment when the weight of accumulated individual decisions became too great for the structures holding them, and what had been a set of distinct problems in distinct farm operations became a systemic condition that reached into every county and every operation simultaneously. The letters from the banks began arriving across Cass County in April and May. Not letters to Ottoline. Her shed carried no debt, but letters that she became aware of through the network of relationships that connects any community. The talk at the Ashland post office, the conversation that stopped when she entered and resumed after she had passed. Foreclosure notices appeared at the Chandlerville courthouse. The first consequence she witnessed directly was Aldous Fenn Greaves. She saw him in Chandlerville in late May, standing outside the county office building where he had worked for the better part of 2 decades, and the difference in his posture from the man who had stood in the seizure yard in 1886 was so complete that she stopped on the sidewalk and looked at him for a moment before she recognized him. The county had consolidated its seizure and auction operations with a larger firm from Springfield, eliminating his position. He had the look of a man who has recently lost the identity that his work had provided and has not yet found anything to replace it. He saw her see him. He went inside the building before she reached the door. The second consequence she witnessed was her uncle. Ruprecht Brecht stood at the fence line in late June, watching 2 men from a bank in Beardstown lead away the pair of draft horses that pulled his primary harvesting equipment. He had borrowed to replace his aging machinery in 1890. And he had missed 2 payments in the spring when a wet planting season reduced his planted acreage, and the subsequent yields could not service what he owed. He stood very still while the horses were let out through the gate. When the men from the bank were gone, he stood there a moment longer, looking at 320 acres of corn, standing ripe in the July heat with nothing to bring it in. Then he turned and looked across the fence line at the 9 red machines, standing in a row behind his niece's shed, and whatever he saw in that moment was not what he had seen in October of 1886. He did not come to her that day. He was not yet ready for what coming to her would require of him. But the fence between them had changed. It had always been a boundary. Now it had become a question. The first farmer to come to the shed arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June, a man from the Virginia Township on the eastern edge of the county, perhaps 45 years old. with the specific expression of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say enough times to have stripped most of the emotion out of it. He had borrowed to buy a new McCormick binder the previous fall. The bank had called the note in May, citing a missed payment and a covenant provision he had not paid sufficient attention to when he signed. The binder was gone. He had 80 acres of winter wheat that had been ready to cut for 10 days. She listened to this without interrupting. When he finished, she told him her rate, her terms, the conditions under which she would schedule his field. He started to explain that the cash condition was difficult at present, given the circumstances. She told him how to approach a grain dealer about a forward purchase on standing crop, told him what to say and what documentation to bring, and roughly what terms he should expect. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the slightly disoriented attention of a man who came to ask for a concession and was instead receiving a solution. He went to Chandlerville that afternoon. He returned with a signed forward purchase agreement. She scheduled his wheat for the following week. Then the second arrived from Browning in Schuyler County. The third came by letter from a farm near Waverly in Morgan County. By the third week of July, people were coming to the shed on most days, and the quality of their visits had a consistent character: the lowered voice, the slightly sideways approach to the subject, the careful phrasing that allowed the speaker to retreat from any admission of vulnerability if the response was not what they hoped. She recognized the pattern because she had seen it in the repair shed, the way farmers talked about mechanical problems they were embarrassed to have let develop so far. The language of avoidance was the same, only the subject had changed. Crispin, now 23, organized the field schedule on the large pasteboard map he had built over 2 seasons, hand-drawn at the county scale, with the township lines and road network established from the county surveyor's maps, updated each season with new field boundaries and access notes. He pinned each contract with a colored flag, a different color for each county. By the end of July, the map had flags in 3 colors, and the density of flags in each county was increasing at a pace that was outrunning anything he had initially planned for. She hired 2 additional operators in the second week of July, men she had observed the previous season and assessed as competent, whose judgment she trusted with equipment she could not personally supervise every hour. She was now running 8 machines in the field, keeping one in reserve as she always had, and the reserve machine was seeing more use than she had anticipated because one machine or another was always needing a field repair, a belt adjustment, a knife section replacement, the ordinary maintenance demands of equipment working at sustained capacity in varying field conditions. The reserve machine mattered because the reserve machine made promises keepable. That was the principle she had established in 1889 and had not deviated from. She did not schedule more acres than she could complete, because completing what you had promised was not optional. Farmers with standing grain could not wait for you to fix a problem you had not planned for. The reserve existed so that when the problem arrived, not if, when there was an answer already in place. Lysander Barrow returned to Ashland in the first week of August. He had been in the county for 2 days, talking to farmers about the foreclosures and the credit situation, and had heard the field schedule was full, that people were coming from Morgan County and Schuyler County, that the operation had expanded well past what he had described in the previous year's piece. She recognized his wagon in the yard before she finished the morning's knife section check on Machine 3, and she finished the check before going out to meet him, because the knife sections were her responsibility and his schedule was his own. She brought him inside to Crispin's map. He stood in front of it for a long time without speaking, reading the flags, counting them. He had the stillness of a man in the presence of something that is revising a conclusion he had already reached. Crispin handed him the field ledger without being asked. Barrow opened it and began reading names. Some of them he had spoken to in the past 2 days, farmers who had described losing their equipment to foreclosure, who had described the particular helplessness of watching ripe grain stand in a field with no machine to bring it in. He was reading the roster of people he had interviewed about the crisis, and each name in the field ledger was a name that had found a different outcome at Ottoline's shed than the one he had been documenting. He read quietly for a long time. When he looked up, there was something past professional interest in his expression. 47 contracts. She was reviewing a fuel calculation on the opposite wall and did not turn around. Through yesterday, he did the arithmetic in the same shorthand he had used the previous year: the acreage, the rate, the season to date. The number was larger than the previous year's. Significantly larger, because the previous year had been a normal season and this was not a normal season. This was the season when everyone who had depended on equipment they no longer owned needed someone who had equipment they did own. The number he arrived at was not the kind of number that appears in a story about a woman in an implement repair shed in Ashland, Illinois. It was the kind of number that appeared in stories about large commercial operations in Chicago. He offered the ledger back to her. She took it and returned it to its place on the shelf beside her father's cloth-bound volume and her own. 3 ledgers in a row. The sequence of a trade passing through time. The piece Barrow wrote that fall ran on the front page of the agricultural section of the Illinois State Journal, and it was reprinted across Illinois and into Indiana and Iowa. The sentence he had written about the $43 and the 47 contracts was the sentence that traveled furthest and was quoted most often in the reprints, because it was the kind of sentence that contains an arithmetic so clean it carries its own argument without requiring elaboration. She did not read the reprints. What she was doing in October, while the reprints were traveling, was completing the final contracts of the season, reconciling the field ledger against the payments received, and servicing the machines for winter storage. The season had demanded more than any previous one, not because of the scale of operations alone, but because of the quality of attention required to maintain that scale. 9 machines, 8 operators, 47 farms, 3 counties, variable crop conditions, and the daily reality of equipment working at capacity in fields with the particular urgency of the 1,893 harvest, where every delay meant grain that continued to deteriorate in the field, while the farmer watching it had no alternative waiting. She had lost one contract in August, when a bearing failure on Machine 7 in the middle of a corn harvest in Morgan County cost them half a day, and the farmer, a man named Stover, one of the ones she had not previously worked with, who had come to her that season because he had no other option, had lost his patience by the afternoon and made arrangements with a competitor from Jacksonville, who arrived with an ancient separator and a crew of 5 men and finished the field in 3 days instead of 1. She did not argue with Stover's decision. She paid her operators full wages for the lost day, serviced Machine 7 that evening, put it back in field rotation the following morning, and made the entry in her ledger. It recorded what had failed when, what the repair required, and what the scheduling consequence had been. It did not record her opinion of the situation, because her opinion of the situation was not useful information. Crispin had been watching the field schedule since July, with the focus of someone managing something he had expected but not predicted the timing of. He had the same quality her father had possessed in a different register, the ability to hold a complex system in his mind and read the relationships within it to see the constraint before it became a problem. When Machine 6's real timing drifted in the second week of August, producing the slightly wrong engagement sound that she had taught him to hear in the spring of 1,887, it was Crispin who identified it during a field visit and pulled the machine from rotation for a half-day adjustment before the drift became a failure. He logged it in the field ledger and moved to the next item on his schedule. She saw it in the log 2 days later and made no comment, because no comment was required. The log was the comment. The apologies came in the sequences she had expected, which did not make them simple. Aldous Fenn Greaves came to the shed on an afternoon in early April of 1894, when the ground had softened enough to take a boot print but not enough to take a wagon wheel cleanly. Came on foot. She was at the bench doing the pre-season knife section inventory when she heard the crunch of his footsteps on the yard gravel, and she did not look up immediately, because the inventory was at a point where interruption would cost her the count. She finished the count, made the entry, and turned around. He looked like a man who had spent the winter deciding whether to make this trip and had resolved to make it without arriving at any peace about the decision. He was holding his hat with both hands, turning the brim in the continuous motion of a person whose hands need something to do while the rest of them are occupied with something difficult. He stopped a few feet from the bench, looked at the row of 9 machines visible through the open shed doors, then looked at her. In the Chandlerville yard, his voice had the roughened quality of words that had been rehearsed enough to become dry. 1,886. I said the $43 wouldn't cover 9 tow-outs. He stopped. The hat turned in his hands. I remember exactly what I said. The shed was quiet except for the early April sound of wind moving through the oak branches at the property edge. She looked at him with the level attention she had brought to everything in this shed. For 20 years, not warm, not cold, simply present. The silence extended past the point where most people would have filled it. I remember that yard, Aldous. Her voice carried the same quality as her ledger entries, accurate, without surplus. She did not offer him absolution because absolution was not hers to offer and would not have been honest. She did not add to the harm by cataloging what his words had cost her in the months that followed. She put the memory where it belonged, as a fact between 2 people who had both been present for it, and let it rest there without resolution in either direction. He nodded once, a short deliberate movement. He put his hat back on. He walked out of the yard without turning around, and she listened to his footsteps on the gravel until they were gone, then turned back to the knife section inventory and found her place and continued from where she had stopped. Wilhelmina Drost's letter arrived with the final payment from the Drost family's harvest contract in October. It was written on Cass County Agricultural Women's Society letterhead, in a formal hand that had the quality of language composed and reconsidered several times. It said that statements had been made that were not fair, that the Drost harvest had been completed on time and correctly, that she was writing to acknowledge what she had said in the Ashland General Store in November of 1886. She signed her full name. She did not ask for a response. Ottoline read the letter, put it in the folder where she kept correspondence related to accounts, and wrote Wilhelmina Drost's payment receipt in the same hand she wrote all payment receipts. Ruprecht Brecht came in October of 1894, a year later than the others, which was consistent with what she knew of him, He was a man who arrived at his conclusions slowly and then held them with the permanence of something that had taken a long time to set. He came in his wagon, which was the same wagon he had driven to the fence line in 1886, though it showed the 8 years of use that had passed since then. He climbed down this time, which was different from 1886, and he came into the yard carrying something under his arm. It was a small notebook, smaller than her father's main ledger, with a cover that had gone soft with age. She recognized it before he was close enough for her to read the writing on the first page. Recognized it the way you recognize something you have not seen in a long time, but that occupied a specific place in your earliest memory of the world. Her father had carried that notebook in his coat pocket during the years when he was first establishing the business, before the main ledger grew to accommodate the full record. It contained the entries from 1855 through 1858, the years of the first repairs and the first observations and the first calibrations of what a machine could do and what it actually did in the hands of the men who owned it. She had not known Ruprecht had it. She had not known it still existed. He set it on the bench beside the knife section tray without ceremony. He did not offer an explanation because the object was its own explanation, and any words he added to it would have been lesser than what it said without them. He stood there for a moment with the look of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and has set it down and is not yet sure what to do with his hands. "I should have asked you what you saw," he said, "instead of telling you what I thought you were doing." She looked at the notebook. She looked at him. In his pale blue eyes, which were her father's eyes, she saw something that had not been there in 1886 or in the years of the fence line silence that followed, not defeat, which would have been easier to receive, but the specific expression of a man who has revised himself at some cost and is standing in the aftermath of the revision. The 4 years of silence between them had been his, but she was honest enough, in her private accounting, to acknowledge that she had not worked to end it either. They had both been certain of things, and certainty was not always the same as correctness. "You asked me plain," she said. "I didn't explain plain enough." He looked at the notebook on the bench. It should have been with the others all along. He meant the ledgers on the shelf, the main one and her own. He was right. The 1858 entries belonged with the sequence that the main ledger continued, and she had not known they were missing because she had not known they existed. He was also right in the way she felt but did not say, which was that he was offering her the earliest record of her father's thinking, the beginning of the method before the method had a name, as a form of accounting that was not the same as apology but was what he had instead of it. She put the notebook on the shelf to the left of the main ledger, where it belonged by date. 3 volumes in sequence now. Her father's complete record from 1855 to 1879, and her own from 1879 forward. What she was looking at was not a collection of repair records, but the complete account of a trade moving through 2 generations of the same hands, with all the knowledge that had been accumulated and tested and documented and preserved against the day someone would need it. She needed it still. She expected to need it for many years. Ruprecht stood in the doorway of the shed a moment longer, looking at the line of machines, then at his niece, then at nothing in particular that she could identify. He put his hat on and walked back to his wagon without the weight he had carried into the yard. She watched him go. The fence between them had not disappeared, but it had become something you could open a gate in, and that was sufficient. The business entered 1895 with 41 contracts already scheduled, drawn from the previous season's clients, and from referrals that had arrived through the fall and winter. Crispin managed the scheduling with an efficiency that had become second nature, negotiating between competing field dates, field access conditions, crop types, and equipment availability with the quiet confidence of someone who has internalized a complex system and no longer needs to think hard about its basic operations. He had hired a second assistant by then, a young man from Chandlerville, who showed the same quality of observational attention that had distinguished Crispin at 16, and he was transmitting what he knew in the same way Ottoline had transmitted it to him, through questions rather than explanations, through pointing at things and asking what was there. She watched this without comment, the way her father had watched her, letting the learning happen at its own pace in its own way. The 9 original machines were still in the line behind the shed, maintained to the same standard she had established in 1888. She had added 2 newer McCormick sets to the fleet in 1894, purchased from a dealer in Springfield with cash from the previous season's operations, and the newer equipment offered improvements in capacity and efficiency that the older machines could not match. But the original 9 remained operational, remained in service rotation, remained the proof of the original calculation, not as sentiment, but as working equipment that had earned its position by performing exactly as the calculation had predicted it would. On the first morning of the 1895 harvest season, before the crews departed for the fields, before the horses were hitched and the field ledger was opened to the first contract of the year, Crispin walked to machine number 2, and ran through the pre-operation check in the sequence Ottoline had established in 1,888 knife sections: real timing, concave clearance, elevator canvas tension, drive chain, fuel. He was thorough and quiet, moving around the machine with the fluency of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become indistinguishable from understanding. When the check was complete, he engaged the starting mechanism, and the machine caught in its first revolution and ran at the clean, even pace that the McCormick design produced. When the timing was correct, and the clearances were correct, and the maintenance had been done as it should have been done, the sound moved out across the flat morning fields of Cass County, Illinois. It was the same sound it had been in 1,888, and it would be the same sound for seasons that neither of them could count yet, because the machine had been built correctly and restored correctly and maintained correctly, and things built and restored and maintained correctly do not fail in the ways that things neglected or dismissed or priced at their scrap value fail. They persist, they do the work. They outlast the predictions of the people who did not believe in them. Some people look at an old machine and calculate what it costs to keep running. A banker sees depreciated collateral. A neighbor at a cedar fence sees a fool's errand dressed in fresh paint. Ottoline Brecht Halversen looked at 9 machines that the county had priced at $43, and she heard the only thing she had ever heard. When she listened carefully to something most people had already decided was finished, she heard what it could still do.